Greetings, dear listeners. Today's topic will be spontaneous spiritual awakenings, and I will be discussing it with Jessica Cornet. Welcome, Jessica. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here. And it's very nice that you can pronounce my surname.
Lovely. Yeah, well, that helps. If you're from Belgium, then you know French a bit. Jessica, before we delve in, could you first be so kind to present yourself to the listeners so that they get a bit of a grasp of why it's exactly you that I invited to talk about spiritual awakenings?
Well, I am a research psychologist and I focus on spontaneous spiritual awakenings. I've published a couple of papers now. One is under review. But my first paper, it was, observing the phenomenology of these experiences, experiences that are quite underreported and quite underrepresented within the world of psychology. So I believe that's why you've invited me here. Yeah. And beyond that, I myself have had a very profound spiritual awakening experience. So I have both the experiential side of the experience and also the more scientific outlook on these experiences.
Now I'm wondering, do you want to bring it in while we are talking about certain topics, or do you want to say something more about your personal spiritual awakening right now?
I mean, I can quickly delve into it, even though, by its very nature, it's an experience that is very, very hard to put into words. Mm-hmm. It's ineffable and, almost 8 years down the line, and I'm still struggling to find the right words to describe them. But I went to bed one night an atheist, and then I woke up the next morning identifying as spiritual but not religious, or rather not identifying as anything, but understanding that there's possibly more than meets the two eyes and the five senses that we can perceive.
What happened during that night for such a change of heart?
I had a very profound lucid dream. It was an incredible lucid dream. And I had been able to lucid dream before in my life, but this was a completely different dream. It was like the dream, the big dream. And within it, I was asking many individual characters that I knew intuitively to be scientists, philosophers, people who were kind of great thinkers. And I was asking each and every one of them, what is the meaning of life? And they would each come back at me with a very beautiful, eloquent sentence. But upon waking, and the reason why I don't necessarily always bring this aspect up with regards to my awakening is because I see it as a sort of separate event that might be very related to it. But upon awakening from my dream, I didn't just awaken and start thinking about my dream and consider, wow, what was that? What an incredible dream that I had. What is the meaning of life? No, what happened when I woke up was an actual awakening to a new reality, or rather a reality that I feel had always been around me, but that I had been blinded to until that very moment. So it felt as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and that I could finally see life for what it truly was in its true essence, as an interconnected present moment that works in a continuum. It's very hard, again, to describe it with words, but, many things happen. So I had this deep sense of interconnection or oneness. And I knelt down on my bed and I just had this immense sense of unconditional love, a love that I'd never experienced before. And I grew up, full of love, luckily. So I've not had an extraordinarily traumatic childhood or anything like that. And I just had this beautiful sense of being in the present moment, this deep sense of understanding that all is one, and that there is a sort of intelligence or benevolence or aliveness that pervades the universe. And now I come to term it as a consciousness being primary or fundamental in the universe. But at the time, it felt more like an aliveness or an intelligence. So there's many, many aspects that I could go into, but I will throw it back to you.
Okay, lovely. Thanks for sharing that mystical experience. And like you say, it's always difficult to bring it under words, and that's what the mystics have been saying for thousands of years. But even though we can't bring it under words, somehow we seem to be talking about it all the time and trying to find words for it. But that really brings us to the general topic quite immediately, because let's perhaps first start. You gave your own personal experience, which to many people might sound anecdotal. Those who've researched it a bit of course, know that what you're describing is something that many people experience. But still, if we're going to use a word like spontaneous spiritual awakenings, perhaps try to delineate somehow, because that might include a whole lot of things, experiences like yours, but perhaps also completely other experiences that might not be completely the same. So why lump them all together into one big box of the term spontaneous spiritual awakenings?
Of course, this is highly subjective, and any word that we come to use is highly subjective, essentially. And what I term as a spiritual awakening may sound like something very different to you or to somebody else. But I feel that it's quite a how to say it, the quality of the word awakening is really likened to what an awakening feels like, in that it's a sort of opening to an essential reality that lies beyond the materialistic reality that we are involved in. So it does feel, in many cases, through my own experience, but also through the conversations that I've had with many, many individuals since my experience as part of my work, it feels like an awakening, an opening to something greater, to greater essence of life. So I feel that the word spiritual awakening is actually a very good term to use when it comes to describing these experiences.
If I understand you correctly, it's the awakening part that does it for you. People have the feeling that they awaken, that a portal opens, and when they go through the portal, that they get into a new reality. That's what you would take as the circumscription of what spiritual awakenings are.
The way I understand it, the way I've experienced it, yes, it feels like not so much the awakening to a new reality, but to an old reality that we were perhaps not aware of. It's a sense of deepened awareness or self-realization, and that in itself is an awakening. But of course, there may be better definitions, better terms to use. And I think since we're just beginning to really uncover these kinds of experiences from a scientific perspective, we're still figuring things out as to, the best terms to use, the most inclusive ones, and the ones that want to say what we really want to say in the best way possible. Some people have referred to these experiences as a cosmic consciousness experience, self-realization, non-dual experience, enlightenment. But I often feel that some of these terms, they carry more of a religious baggage, which may not necessarily be pertinent to the experiencer. So to me, the word spiritual awakening is more of a neutral term that one can use to describe that kind of experience. But like you say, it has its, there are downfalls to using that word, and it may not mean the same thing for everybody else. But essentially, the golden thread that I feel lies within this particular experience, and whilst there may be a host of different characteristics involved in them, is this deep sense of interconnection, oneness, a sense that it's a noetic experience. So it's deeply embodied and experiential rather than a considered thought or a theory or an idea that one has. A lot of people describe it as a cellular experience, in that it feels like your whole body is vibrating with this energy, with this newfound life force. And of course, this deeper sense of love, towards the universe or whatever you want to call it.
There's many things there that you've said that we could delve into. So let's unpack and let's start with the attempt to scientifically approach spontaneous spiritual awakenings and the way you did it in your article. So I read your whole article, which I really liked, and then there were 3 personal takeaways for me, and I'll just summarize them, and then we can move forward and go into each one of them. So my first takeaway was, in the field of psychology, spiritual awakenings are still often either pathologized or not taken seriously enough as profound experiences that really have beneficial effects on the lives of people. That's one. 2, although there might be a huge variety of spontaneous spiritual awakenings, as we've already been discussing a bit, it does seem like there's a common substrate to them. So that's what you're implying, and we can get a bit deeper into that. And then the spontaneous spiritual awakenings that are not drug-induced seem to have even stronger impacts on people than those that are drug-induced. That's also something that I took away. Does that sound like what you wanted people to take away as a message from your article, or am I missing something?
No, I think you've hit the nail on its head for some of your points. So I think we should go into them one at a time. In that, I think the first point that you raised, that
Mm-hmm.
of these experiences typically being pathologized by
Mm-hmm.
default, I think that's very, very much true. And I think it's a very unfortunate aspect of our society, one that isn't necessarily conducive or even in the knowledge of these kinds of experiences as a human possibility, as a possibility of human consciousness. And many societies around the world throughout the ages have discussed, depicted, considered these experiences as true goals almost, as part of a healthy human lifestyle and healthy human existence. I suppose that's also why many people adhere to specific religions. I mean, one of the many aspects why religion can be beneficial for humans. But I feel that essentially there is a deeper longing within us all to attain certain states of consciousness that are aligned with this greater sense
Mm-hmm.
of reality. And I don't think there's anything too odd about the fact that mainstream psychology, doesn't really acknowledge these experiences. I think it's just the way, the fact that modern psychology is only just really starting to unravel and unpack these experiences. So we don't really know very much about their prevalence, about their well-being effects, and how they overlap with mental health disorders, because of course there are mental health disorders which carry certain spiritual, let's say, symptoms to them. And there haven't been very many studies, partly because it's very hard to study this, but there haven't been very many studies to identify the similarities and the differences between mental health disorders with a spiritual essence to them and spiritual experiences that are occurring as experiences in their own right without the presence of a mental health disorder. And I think, for psychiatrists and psychologists and clinical psychologists and mental health workers who have not had any sort of training in the fact that people can have spiritual experiences that might not necessarily overlap with mental health disorders, and that these experiences, whilst they're more common potentially than we think, but they're still not extraordinarily common within any society, I don't think, means that perhaps there aren't that many people within those kinds of positions who have had a direct experience of awakening or even any form of spiritual experience, or don't potentially know anybody within their circles who have. So they automatically would classify that as something that is external to the normal kind of spectrum of what one might be able to experience in life. And so automatically it's pathologized. And because our society, like I said, I've already alluded to, our society isn't really, it's a very secular society. We haven't really retained very many wisdoms from the religions that we have had. We've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater in many respects. So I don't think much importance is placed on these experiences. But I think now people are starting to return to this sense of wanting to explore their consciousness and wanting to understand the limits or go beyond the limits of their human potential. And science is also beginning to catch up with that very slowly.
Could you, for the listeners, perhaps explain or give a concrete example of something that might be pathologized? Because I'm not sure whether every one of our listeners will be very acquainted with the literature. And you've already mentioned your own experience, which is a spiritual experience that is obviously beneficial to you and not something to be pathologized. So I guess that the listeners will be aware of what that is. But perhaps something that you just encountered where you noticed here some psychologist is pathologizing something that doesn't necessarily have to be. So perhaps make it a bit more concrete if you can.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for instance, when one has this kind of experience, there can be a sense of liberation that might come from it, a sense that one doesn't necessarily feel that they want to conform with the way that this society, which is quite void of much emotion in many respects, doesn't really suit them anymore. And this can sometimes be misinterpreted as a sense of grandiosity, as something that's related with something like manic depression or a bipolar disorder. I mean, just to give you a very brief example, that I think that's a good example to bring up because it's coupled with, other characteristics of these experiences, such as potentially this greater sense of being, and this expansive mode might be interpreted as something that is not necessarily, healthy. When actually, when you speak to these individuals, oftentimes you'll find that the experience was incredibly beneficial. And, by saying that, I'm not saying that there aren't also individuals who have that kind of experience and then have a sort of spiritual crisis, or who could be diagnosed with something like bipolar disorder. But again, we need to tease out the differences between them, because there are differences between these kinds of experiences.
Yeah. Even if you have bipolar disorder, then still your spiritual awakening can be a real awakening, of course.
Oh,
Doesn't
yeah,
matter.
of course.
Okay, so we've got that clarified. But then something I want to pick up on, that you mentioned that psychology has just been trying to understand and has gotten to it only recently. And I'd like to push back on that a little bit, because two things. One, we've always known those experiences exist. Like you say, in religious context, they're pretty normative and supposed to be something that people generally might or possibly could have. So in a sense, historically, it's not like we've never known. And a lot of people have had them, and there's lots of literature from the mystics to say but one thing. And on the other hand, then you've got someone you refer to as well in the article, William James. It's 1912, I believe. He wrote The Variety of Religious Experiences.
I think it was 1902 even.
1902 even. Look at that. So that means that for more than 120 years, that book has been written. And in a sense, it's one of the foundational texts of psychology as a field. So what is happening there if that seminal book, which is clearly about the sort of spiritual experience that you're talking about, has been foundational to psychology as a field, and somehow it got forgotten? Or it never really got forgotten, I know, and you've got transpersonal psychology and so on, which really flows from the Jamesian tradition, let's say. So it has always been there. But what is this, let's say, in Jungian terms, what is this shadow side of the psychological field? This field that constantly acts like, oh, some people are dealing with spiritual experiences we didn't know. Yes, you knew. They were always there in the field itself. Your field is kind of built on it. So what is this subconscious substrate that is not recognized? Why? Why do we keep on thinking that it's only now that psychology is taking it seriously, while William James was already doing it in 1902?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could be going into a whole philosophical conversation about this. Many psychologists have tried to understand and bring forth a better understanding of spiritual experiences and altered states in psychology. And you mentioned the transpersonal psychology movement, especially in the 60s and 70s. And, they've been fundamental to the progress that we've made in understanding this phenomena better. But I still think there is something within us, within individuals brought up in this particular, very consumeristic society, that doesn't believe that there is more. And when you don't believe, it doesn't matter how much people tell you that there may be something more to life than this, you still won't necessarily engage with it. So that's, maybe a very simplistic way of putting it, but I think that people are just so much in their everyday survival mode that potentially they don't think that there's even any point in entertaining this idea. And then I feel that these experiences are being investigated a little bit more now, because we have some technology, it's not refined still, but some neuroimaging technology that's now been saying, hey, like psychedelic states might be related to this part of the brain shutting down, or this part of the brain being more active. And that's similar to contemplative practices. And what's something in common between these two? Oh, they both elicit mystical experiences. So maybe there's something more to mystical experiences than just imagination, or people being primed to having these experiences, or people, so I think, there is just more technology now. And again, I wish to stress that it's still not refined enough for us to really be able to understand what is going on in the brain. And it also does not really pay attention to the body side of things, but that's for another conversation. But yeah, so people are starting to take that more seriously. And since science is the new religion, you know, whatever is investigated in science is considered important in many respects. And so it should. But like you said, these experiences have been talked about, discussed throughout the ages in innumerable cultures throughout the world. And they've often been shunned. So, yeah, there's something about all of that which also relates to our inherently colonial way of viewing the world, potentially. Yeah.
In what sense? That's an interesting aspect. Could you elaborate a bit more on that one? How you see that?
I think, you know, Western psychology is really based on the findings, of course, of mostly white Western individuals, which is fine, but it often overlooks the experiences that might be had or discussed in other parts of the world, such as in indigenous traditions or in Eastern cultures. And, you know, whilst we may have a fascination with these cultures, they're not necessarily taken very seriously within science or within biomedical sciences. They're kind of observed from an anthropological lens or through philosophy, but not so much through science. And if the substrate or the basis of science lies in human experiences, then we also ought to be looking at the human experiences that are had outside of our Western bubble.
Yeah, and that leads us to the commonality of spiritual experience among all people all over the world, and that will be the second topic. But before we get there, I'd like to ask some technical question, because we're in this topic of psychology and how it looks at spiritual experiences. Because in your article, something that I could relate to just a little bit less, because I'm not too acquainted with that specific type of literature, and it's about temporal lobe liability and trait absorption. And what do those exactly mean, and what was your finding about those elements when it comes to spontaneous spiritual awakenings, and why are they important for the field of psychology?
Yeah. Temporal lobe lability relates to, it's symptomatic of the epileptiform disturbances in the temporal lobes. And the temporal lobes are associated with things like memory recall, time and space perception, and so on. And so we wanted to understand whether there was a correlation between the reported intensity of our participants' symptoms of temporal lobe lability and the intensity of their spontaneous spiritual awakening or reported awakening experience. And we found that there was a very strong correlation between individuals reporting stronger temporal lobe lability and those reporting stronger spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences. In other words, it might indicate that individuals with something like temporal lobe epilepsy might be more likely to have a spontaneous awakening experience, and the opposite is also true. I mean, this correlation is not directional here, so we weren't able to determine the directionality of the correlation, but could also mean that people who have these experiences are probably more likely to have what's called a temporal lobe epilepsy, right?
But doesn't that lead us back to pathologizing eventually, and giving the floor to people who want to say, oh, see, all those mystical states, it's nothing but a form of epilepsy?
Not necessarily, because again, epilepsy is just a word that we use to describe what's going on in the brain. And I think it's important, you know, I mean, the basis of my work is absolutely not to diminish the experience to a set of neural correlates or oscillations in the brain. But I think rather than seeing a scientific investigation as something that is pigeonholing an experience into a more materialistic framework, I wish to open up these experiences so that they're not only discussed in anthropology, philosophy, and so on, but also for them to be acknowledged within the realm of science. And that's also done through looking at the brain. I think that the brain does have something to do with these experiences, but I don't believe that the brain is the only tool for these experiences. And it doesn't explain why these experiences are so powerful and are often considered one of life's most important, you know, experiences. Yeah. So even if it were to just be something to do with the brain, I don't believe that, you know, that's necessarily the most important aspect of these experiences. What's important is, why do we have this possibility to feel one with,
Yeah.
a greater sense of
And feeling one with the greater whole, that brings us to trait absorption, I guess. Isn't that just a fancy psychological name for saying
Mhm.
a oneness experience?
Well, trait absorption is more the level of a focus that one might have on a given stimulus without effort or
Ah,
control. So it's kind of it has been associated in science with things like what one might call hypnotizability or
mm,
fantasy proneness, which I absolutely hate this
yeah.
term fantasy proneness, but it's been associated in previous studies with these kinds of psychological traits. But again, for me, the reason we wanted to look at this is because we want to know whether certain people might be more prone to having these kinds of experiences, or whether certain activities that are associated with a higher sense of higher trait absorption might be more conducive to these kinds of experiences.
What are the traits being absorbed into what? What is
Into
the
any given stimulus without effort or control. So kind of
your
what the word
whole
means.
sense of being, your whole focus, yourself is being absorbed in the focal point that you're.
Yeah, so when you focus on something but you're not even aware
Yeah,
that you're
yeah,
focusing on something,
yeah.
that's more or less what trait absorption
Absorption
measures.
is
Yeah.
okay.
So like when you kind of if, in a meditation state, for example, if you're
Yeah,
doing a tratakum meditation with a flame in front of you and you're
yeah.
observing that flame, and then you eventually get engrossed so deeply into this
That you
flame
become
and
the
this
flame.
relationship, you almost dissolve as an ego.
Yeah.
To put it fancifully, that would indicate high trait absorption.
Okay.
And there are certain activities like chanting or drumming, communal drumming, that are actually related with heightened trait absorption. So they've measured the brains of people or trait absorption levels before these kinds of activities and then after, and they've noticed a shift in trait absorption. So that might be indicative to the fact that these practices might be more conducive potentially to a spiritual awakening. But this is something that you and I probably can, wrap our head around. But since there's no data really within the realm of psychology, it is important to kind of state the obvious sometimes as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. See, sometimes when I read articles like yours and some of the things in there, it feels like indeed you have to somehow say the obvious, or because you're talking about experiences, and in a religious sense, those experiences are easily explained within the traditional words and metaphors and symbols that are present in every religious tradition. And then in psychology, it becomes this effort to extract, just like we do in biology. Instead of seeing the plant, we're starting to extract every cell and molecule and whatever, and then somehow that explains better what the plant is than simply seeing and eating the plant or something like that. So there's something strange there. Is it a good idea to extract all those trait absorption and temporal lobe liability? Will that really give us a better insight into the experience than what religion has done for thousands of years?
I think so, because I think there's value in observing these experiences and picking them out scientifically, kind of like, in archaeology, you've got the sort of nail and hammer and you're slowly chipping away at what is possibly like quite obviously underneath the layer of earth. And you're doing it very slowly, and it may not feel necessarily that important in that moment when you're picking away very slowly at a certain point, but you need to lay that kind of groundwork in order to get to the deeper levels of understanding. And since I'm not saying that a scientific understanding of these experiences will help us understand the nature of reality better necessarily, but they will help inform psychology and mental health workers and clinicians on how to better deal with individuals presenting themselves with these experiences within their office, their medical office. So there is a true problem, and we've already touched on it in mental health care, in that these individuals are not necessarily taken very seriously, or they're brushed off as just having a psychopathology or a mental health disorder. And so I do think it's important to try and understand the brain and certain psychological traits involved in these experiences to better understand the experience as a holistic experience, which occurs both outside and and within the brain. And it also, if we end up understanding the brain better on these experiences, then we'll also potentially be able to design even more effective tools to help people reach these kinds of states. I know religion has many tools through which to understand and elicit these kinds of experiences, but equally, not everybody relates to a sort of more dogmatic or closed off type of religion, and they want to feel more open and more secular in their experience of spirituality. So I think we need to cater to everyone as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there another problem also not in psychology that experience is a general problem in psychology? It's about the inner stirrings of the mind. But even if you can find in the brain certain seemingly similar patterns, that doesn't even prove that people are experiencing the same thing. How do you go about, or do you take a leap of faith that what you see in the brain actually does represent a particular experience?
I mean, again, this will take decades of work, if not more. We're nowhere near understanding the neural substrates or the oscillations that are related to these experiences in the brain anyway. There are so many different, factors and things happening in the brain and in the body and in the environment around you at once that it's very hard to pick out certain neural correlates in the brain when an experience is being had. But there are ways of observing the differences between a certain experience, of kind of unpicking what parts of the brain are involved in certain experiences. So I hopefully will eventually be able to understand what happens under the influence of a non-psychedelic experience.
There's also an aspect there that it's indeed connected to a lot of things and also outside ourselves. So one problem of experience is also, in my view, that we tend to, in Western psychology, to individualize them. That's what psychology is about, your personal mind. But when we talk about spiritual experiences, they cannot be anything but expressed in cultural artifacts and norms and archetypes and symbols and representations and so on. So, and certainly because you also in your article, you see a subset of spontaneous Kundalini awakenings, and you compare them to other types of spontaneous spiritual awakenings. And that's a good example, I think. If you ask a Western person whether he had a rise of his Kundalini in his body, when the concept only makes sense to that person because he has read spiritual literature from the West, or you ask the same question to an Indian who is ingrained and meshed in a different cultural matrix, how can we even know that we are talking about the same thing when we talk about such a Kundalini experience? Because most probably the popular spiritual literature and what it says about it is quite something different than what traditionally in, let's say, tantric settings. Tantra in itself is a very good example. Tantra in the West really isn't what Tantra in the East is about. So it gives this whole... there's a disjoint there between researching experience and trying to get at what are people really experiencing when they say they have this type of experience, when that experience can only be expressed in cultural manners. And those cultural manners don't necessarily determine the experience, but they do determine how you will see them yourselves.
Oh, I completely agree. And I mentioned that in the limitations of my paper as well, in that those who define their experiences as spontaneous Kundalini awakening may have been more exposed to yogic texts, and they may, and actually I think we found a correlation between that anyway. I think it was all very exploratory, by the way, so it doesn't claim to have any answers, but what we wanted to find, actually, rather more so than understanding the terms through which people identified their experience with, but we wanted to understand whether there was a relationship between the reported negative effects and the reported physical effects. And this again was totally exploratory, and that's because I do a lot of reading, and I have been fully engaged in this kind of literature for 8 years now, and I've also spoken to many people who claim to have had some form of this kind of experience, and I came across this idea that something might be related through all of those encounters, both with literature and with people. And I wanted to see whether there was a relationship between the negative aspect and the physical aspect. And we didn't find a correlation there. So, yeah, it was very exploratory. But I completely agree. I completely agree with you when you say that it is everything that we discussed is kind of mediated by the cultural framework through which we see the world.
And that actually brings us to a really philosophical and even theological point. If we're going to say that the experiences that people have somehow do indeed interrelate, that's to say they're the same experience and we're really talking about the same thing on a spiritual level, don't we necessarily have to first kind of not agree, but posit as a hypothesis that there's a spiritual reality out there? But that's something that in contemporary psychology, at least in the West, you can't really say. But it seems to me that the experiences don't make any sense if that reality isn't out there. And they make a lot of sense if it's a real ground of being that people can tap into. Then, of course, if we can all tap into the same ground of being, then obviously we're going to have somehow a bit of the same experience. But as long as that is not there and we're just disjointed individual minds, then there's nothing that can really make our minds comparable to one another.
This is the kind of conversation that really gets me, gets my heart just pumping. It makes me feel alive because I absolutely agree. And I do believe that this is obviously my own belief. And I know it's shared by many people, probably including yourself, that there is an inherent essence, an inherent spiritual essence that can be tapped into. And philosophers have discussed this at great length in literature, like, the Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley, for example. But I think the more we investigate and look at the phenomenology of these experiences cross-culturally, the more we will understand that there is something there, a common experience that is had and has been had throughout the ages and throughout the cultures, that matches up. And it seems to be the case, and so I think that seems to be indicative that the kind of perennialism of spirituality, if I can say that, and that the inherent essence of spirituality, of a fundamental consciousness being inherent and pervading in the universe. But that's philosophical, and it's probably not something that we can prove through the very limited scientific tools that we have. And maybe it's not necessary.
Yeah. A lot of people don't get to that experience through science, but through psychedelics. And so I want to get to the last aspect that I took out of your paper, which was that spontaneous spiritual awakenings that are not drug-induced tend to have sometimes stronger impacts, let's say, on the lives of people on many levels, at various levels that you researched in your paper. And for me personally, it doesn't really surprise me, but I want to hear your thoughts first. Did you think that was surprising? Because certainly in today's discourse about psychedelics, it is often presented as this extravagantly opening experience, and in the materialistic context of today, where people think that stuff or that things, whether it's pills or other things that you can use, can influence you and bring about certain experiences within yourself, it might seem that people could think that, yeah, of course you have such an experience and it's way stronger than any other type of experience because it was drug-induced, and it seems like more logical from a materialistic perspective that the drug-induced experience would be stronger. And you found the opposite. Again, I'm not that surprised, but I'd like to have your take on this one.
Yeah, it was an interesting finding, although not one that I was surprised with. But I hear your point, because Psychedelics can also induce things like visions, really powerful visions and fractals. And, whilst that may be the case with certain people having the experience spontaneously, it's not so common, and it's certainly not a predominant factor of these experiences, i.e. you can have this great sense of unconditional love and interconnection and sense of peace and oneness and so on without any visions, without hearing any voices, without seeing anything that isn't physically present. So one would have expected the psychedelic experience perhaps to have had a more profound effect, but I'm not surprised about the fact that the spontaneous one had more of a strong effect. But, why I say that, I mean, it's mostly based on intuition and through speaking to people who've had both experiences. And I think potentially the reason why the spontaneous experience is more powerful or more reported as powerful is because there is somewhat of a surprise element to it as well, in that people are not necessarily having these experiences through any form of context, any spiritual idealism or any religious framework or anything like that. And so when they have this experience, certainly that was the case for me, it is even more powerful because it kind of shows you so drastically this shift, this alternate reality, let's say, this alternate layer or dimension of reality that was always there. And then you're like, whoa, like I wasn't even exposed to that through literature. I wasn't exposed to that through any of my belief systems. And yet I'm having this experience. So I know for it to be true, at least for my own self, at least from a subjective, personal and first-hand point of view. Whereas maybe if you take a psychedelic or you're having these experiences through a prolonged period of contemplative practice, then you might already know that these experiences are a thing, that you might reach this state. And so that might make it perhaps as beautiful as the spontaneous experience, but maybe less shocking and so less powerful in general. That's one of the ideas. I think it's also worth mentioning in our study that we were comparing reported most powerful spontaneous spiritual awakening with one-off experiences of drug and non-drug induced altered states of consciousness. So it's not a direct comparison. And that was obviously a big limitation, but it's still indicative at the power and strength of these spontaneous experiences. Although when we compared the experience with reported full-blown mystical experiences induced through DMT, we still found that the spontaneous awakening was more powerful overall on all dimensions to the DMT mystical experience.
I read the article, of course, but people who listen to this probably won't have. So perhaps explain to them, how do you define this being stronger, having more impact? What are the measurements for saying such a thing?
Well, there are various psychological measures through which we can kind of try and understand the intensity and the characteristics, the predominant characteristics of certain experiences. In this case, we use the 11D ASC questionnaire, the 11-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire. And it's a very long questionnaire observing the variances of these kinds of altered states of consciousness experiences. So we basically compared the results from a variety of other studies observing altered states of consciousness, both of the induced and non-induced kind, both pharmacological and non-pharmacological, with our spontaneous experience. And then we just looked at the results. For instance, we measured things like time and space distortion, a sense of oneness, a sense of joy and bliss. So these are three of the 11 main aspects of the altered state that was being measured. But within those 11 dimensions, there are many, many, many sub-dimensions. So it's more all-encompassing than it may sound.
And do they, I seem to remember, but I might be confusing some things from the article, but they all also last longer? I mean, the impact just has a general tendency to last longer, because that's something that also has been said a lot about psychedelic experiences these days. It's also mainly researched from a pharmacological perspective, because it might help against depression, might help against getting people off of their addictions and so on. And there is some indication that it might. but there's also a lot of relapse. I've recently talked to a Dutch scholar about it, and there's a lot
Mm.
of relapse. And so, am I correct in thinking that spontaneous spiritual awakenings, which are not drug induced, have a tendency to, if they have a transforming effect, the transforming effect lasts longer, or don't you have any data on that one?
We don't have any data on that one. We tried to measure the peak experience of the spontaneous spiritual awakening, but by their very nature, they're very hard to quantify. It's very hard to quantify the
Yeah.
peak of any experience of the such, because there also seems to be a slight time distortion when you're having these experiences, in that you're not necessarily paying attention at all to what's happening around you. You're not necessarily in a state where you're able to experience time in the usual sense, so it's hard to quantify. But we found we tried to understand whether the peak experience was more within the seconds or the minutes or the hours or the days. And I think what's important from our study is that we found that it doesn't really matter how long or short the reported peak experience was, but it almost always seemed to have a very positive long-term effect. But in comparison to psychedelics, we don't know. We weren't able to perform that kind of study. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, it might be a very interesting follow-up paper on that one.
Yes.
Okay, so getting us a bit to the conclusion of everything, and I'm just going to read a passage from your conclusion. It ends with, given the overwhelming positive reported effects of those experiences on well-being in our study, and given the existing literature supporting the potential for spiritual experiences to both treat disorders such as addiction, depression, and anxiety, and move people towards increased pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors, more attention from the research community is warranted. Brings us back to something that we were talking about really in the beginning, and your point is well taken. But how do you think we can concretely go about integrating spontaneous spiritual awakenings in people's lives? Because there's an element of what I would call, from a Christian perspective, of grace there, of something, it happens to you. It's not something you can induce. That's also a difference with the psychedelic substances. Those can be taken in and then they produce something. Or is that not really what you're talking about? And are you just simply saying that psychologists and in the field should be more aware of what spiritual awakenings are and integrate them within their own psychological assistance to people? Is that what you're saying? Or
Yes.
are you also somehow implying that it might be a good idea to see how we can induce them?
Well, like you say, if we start inducing them, they're no longer spontaneous.
Yeah.
So, no, my point was mostly that of a call to action to the clinical and mental health systems to investigate these experiences more, and researchers mostly, because research informs the way that mental health systems move forward. And so with more research, we'll be able to understand these experiences better and therefore treat them better in individuals who are having harder times with dealing with such profound existential shifts, who may not necessarily have a support network such as a religious group through which to understand the experience better. So it's mostly a call to action for researchers to keep doing their research on these experiences, and for clinicians to take these experiences seriously and to understand that they may have differences with your typical kind of psychosis-based psychopathology.
I understand that one, but shouldn't we also perhaps think a bit about how to induce them? And then they become less spontaneous, perhaps. But because for me, from personal experience, I mean, I don't make a lot of distinction between religion and spirituality, but that's for another podcast. But in a religious traditional sense, most of the most typical practices are pretty much spiritual experience inducing. That's not to say that that's their first and foremost aim, but it's often there. Take fasting, take stuff that you write about in the article as well. People have done them before they had the experience. Going to nature, feeling one with nature, reading spiritual literature. Well, I mean, the whole Christian tradition of Lectio Divina is a good example of it. Prayer and meditation. I do all of those things myself, and they bring me in let's say, daily mystical experiences. The oneness of everything is a thing I live with on a daily basis, and which I'm very glad. And it's really a grace that it's possible to experience them on an almost daily basis. And it's not always as intense, but it's there in the background. And in certain meditations, quite often even, it becomes a bit more intense yet again. So there is this traditional religious way of inducing them, or at least I often talk about democratizing mysticism, because mysticism is often presented as this thing that some mystics have, and sometimes there's one experience in your life. No, it really can be something that you experience quite a lot, and in my sense drives you forward in life.
I completely agree. And I think I mentioned this earlier, that I think with greater research, as well as just through personal practice and finding what's best for you, we can start to bring certain traditions together, or bring certain aspects of these traditions together, and certain practices together to elicit certain strong spiritual type experiences. They may not necessarily be full-blown awakening or enlightenment experiences or non-dual experiences, but they will be important nonetheless, I believe. And so you're right, absolutely. Things like disrupting the homeostatic system, or through fasting, through sleep deprivation. Even I'm not suggesting that one should practice sleep deprivation, but there are many different ways that you disrupt your everyday life system to experience certain altered states. Some ways are more healthy than other. I'm not sure I should have actually mentioned the sleep deprivation. But here you go.
It's a good example. I've been experimenting with waking. I mean, the Desert Fathers used to do it, and they stayed up all night to pray and so on. They went to sleep again. It's not a completely insane sleep deprivation, but that's basically what it is. Staying up all night to meditate and to wake. Waking is a very typical form of religious ritual. And when I experiment with it, yet again, yes, it does bring about an altered state of consciousness. You can't say it any other way.
Exactly. I like this quote by Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was a famous philosopher. Enlightenment is an accident, but certain activities make you accident prone. And that's indeed the case. There are so many things that one can do to facilitate acquiring glimpses of these experiences, if not, full-blown experiences in their lives. And what you mentioned is totally correct. Yeah.
That's a very lovely quote from Krishnamurti. So on that note, perhaps we'll leave it at that. Jessica, this was an absolute delight for me to talk to you about spontaneous spiritual awakenings. And so maybe see you another time.
Thank you. It was a delight for me too.